The first thing she heard was metal screaming. Not shouting screaming. The clang of a gate slammed shut with a violence that rattled her teeth, followed by boots on gravel, a rhythm too practiced to be hurried. The air smelled of coal smoke and disinfectant, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Somewhere behind the barracks, a generator coughed and died, plunging the yard into a gray half-light where faces blurred and uniforms dissolved into shadow. She tightened her grip on the medical bag as a guard barked an order she didn't understand. The question hit her before fear did. Why is a hospital ward surrounded by barbed wire? A stretcher passed dragged its wheels catching on stones. A man moaned once, and then went silent. She stepped forward on instinct, a doctor's reflex overriding caution. I felt the butt of a rifle nudge her shoulder back into line. The bag slipped. Glass clinked. Somewhere, a whistle shrilled, cutting the cold like a blade. And as the gates locked behind her, the realization arrived with sickening clarity. Whatever rules governed the world outside did not apply here. She had entered as a healer. Whether she would be allowed to remain one was the mystery that would decide everything. The camp sat in occupied Europe. In the early years of the war, a place the maps reduced to a dot and the records preferred not to name. Officially, it was a processing center for prisoners of war-captured soldiers awaiting transfer. Unofficially, it was a pressure chamber, a machine designed to test how much the human body and spirit could endure before breaking. She arrived under the protection of a neutral emblem stitched to her coat. Trained in medicine, fluent in triage, accustomed to crisis, she needed to believe that her skills would shield her from the worst of it. Around her were men from half a dozen armies. Uniforms faded to the same gray-brown, identities flattened by hunger and fatigue. The infirmary was a converted warehouse, with cracked windows and a stove that burned only when fuel was available, which was rarely. Supplies were counted, rationed, and often denied. Every decision had weight. Treat one patient with precious antibiotics, and another would go without. Speak up to a guard and risk losing access altogether. Stay silent and watch a preventable death unfold. What was at risk was not just survival. It was the boundary between duty and compromise. The camp commandant made his expectations clear without saying a word. Medicine was permitted as long as it did not interfere with order. Order, she would learn, was a flexible term. And beneath it all lay a hidden danger she could sense but not yet name a current pulling her toward. Choices she had never imagined making. The trigger came on a night when the sirens didn't sound. No air raid, no warning. A truck arrived after curfew, its engine idling too long, exhaust pooling in the yard. Guards unloaded crates stamped with red markings and carried them not to storage, but past the infirmary, toward a sealed wing no prisoners spoke about. Then the wounded began to arrive, too many too fast, injuries inconsistent with drills or accidents, burns without fire, bruises shaped like restraints, a fever that spiked and vanished, leaving men trembling and mute. She asked questions. The answers were rehearsed. Interrogation injuries, training mishaps, necessary measures. When she insisted on seeing the sealed wing, a smile crossed the commandant's face. Final. Access denied. Hours later, a patient whispered a name and pressed a scrap of paper into her palm before slipping into unconsciousness. It listed numbers, dates, and a symbol she recognized from medical journals, one associated with experimental protocols abandoned for being too dangerous. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was administrative. A signature missing from a form. A supply request returned unsigned. Her authority eroded not by force, but by omission. And as dawn broke, pale and uncertain, she understood the immediate danger. Someone had decided what kind of doctor she was allowed to be, and they had begun to close the doors. The camp did not explode into chaos. It tightened, like a fist closing slowly, deliberately, until circulation failed. The first sign was not violence, it was routine. Roll calls grew longer. Boots lingered in front of barracks doors. Guards stopped joking. Laughter, once rare but present, vanished entirely. The wire hummed more often now, charged longer into the night.
Ow.
Its low electrical whine threading through sleep like a mosquito no one could swat. Inside the infirmary, she noticed the change before anyone else. Because sickness always sensed pressure first. Patients stopped healing the way they should. Wounds closed too slowly. Fevers spiked without cause. Men who had survived worse on the front began slipping for no clear reason. When she pressed a hand to a prisoner's chest and counted the rise and fall of breath, she felt a tan exhaustion that had nothing to do with injury. This was the fatigue of containment, of waiting, of being watched. Every morning, she inventoried supplies that shrank, no matter how carefully she rationed them. Morphine vials vanished between counts. Bandages returned stained with chemicals she hadn't used. Someone, somewhere, was touching her domain without permission. That knowledge lodged in her chest like a splinter. From her perspective, the chaos was intimate and relentless. A man convulsing on a cot while another bled quietly in the corner. An orderly whispering that the guards were asking names against specific names. A knock on the infirmary door at an hour. No one knocked. Each moment demanded a decision. And every decision carried consequences she could not see all the way through. From the commandant's office, chaos looked different. It arrived as reports stamped in red ink. Numbers that failed to align. Productivity metrics falling short of expectations. External pressure from Berlin, from inspectors, from a war that was no longer proceeding according to plan. The camp was expected to produce results, order, compliance, information. Medicine was tolerated only insofar as it maintained its functionality, and she was beginning to interfere with functionality. The first direct confrontation came quietly. A junior officer arrived during evening rounds, hands clasped behind his back, eyes drifting just a little too long over the cots. He spoke politely, almost apologetically, as he informed her that several patients under her care would be reassigned at dawn. No explanation? No appeal process? She asked to review their files. He smiled and said those files no longer existed. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at the infirmary desk under a single dim bulb, rewriting notes from memory, compressing observations into coded shorthand only she would recognize. She hid pages inside the lining of medical crates, beneath false bottoms she constructed with scavenged wood. Every scratch of her pen felt loud. Every shadow near the door stretched too far. A scream echoed from somewhere. Beyond the sealed wing, it was cut off almost immediately. The next morning, the patients were gone. In their place were new arrivals, men she had never seen. Already sedated, already labeled with numbers instead of names. Their skin bore injection marks she did not recognize. Their pupils reacted sluggishly to light. When she asked what they had been given, the answer came back smooth and rehearsed. Standard procedure. She knew then that the camp had shifted phases. What followed was not a single catastrophe, but a sustained collapse of moral gravity. The rules no longer bent. They evaporated. Guards stopped asking permission to enter the infirmary. Equipment was removed temporarily and never returned. A white-coated official from outside the camp arrived one afternoon, toured the facilities without meeting her eyes, and left behind a typed directive stamped urgent. From that day on, she was required to submit weekly summaries not of patient recovery, but of tolerance. How much pain? How much stress? How long before resistance gave way to compliance? She wrote lies, carefully measured ones. She understated survivability. Overstated complications? Introduced doubt wherever certainty was demanded. Each falsified figure felt like a tightrope, step necessary, terrifying, irreversible. If discovered, it would not just cost her position. It would cost her patients any protection she still offered. Meanwhile, the camp itself began to fray. Rations were cut again. Soup thinned to cloudy water. Bread grew smaller, then moldy. Fights broke out in the barracks. Quiet ones at first, whispered accusations over stolen crusts. Then sudden bursts of violence that guards ended with clubs. The infirmary filled with bruises shaped like hands, like boots, like despair. One evening, the generator failed completely. Darkness swallowed the infirmary mid-procedure. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sounds arrived, dragged breathing, the clink of metal, a muffled prayer spoken in a language she didn't know. She lit a lantern and kept going, fingers working by memory alone. Sweat ran into her eyes. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion she could no longer deny. When it was over, the patient lived. Outside, the camp remained dark. From the commandant's office, the blackout triggered alarms of a different kind. Security reports stacked up. Sabotage was suspected. Inspections were scheduled. The sealed wing was placed on heightened alert. And somewhere in that tightening net, her name began to circulate not as a problem yet, but as an anomaly. Why did her patients survive longer than projections? Why did her reports contradict expected outcomes? Why did prisoners assigned to her ward demonstrate increased resistance to stress? Questions bred attention. Attention bred danger. She felt it the day a guard lingered behind after rounds, pretending to check a lock that was already secure. The day a crate arrived opened, its contents inventoried twice. The day an orderly was reassigned without warning and never returned. Still, she adapted. She trained prisoners to observe one another, to report symptoms early using innocuous language. She taught breathing techniques disguised as physical therapy. She spread recovery across wards to prevent patterns from emerging. Resistance, she learned, did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered instructions in the dark. And then came the order. She was summoned to the sealed wing not as an observer, but as a consultant. The corridor leading there was freshly scrubbed, the smell of chemicals overpowering. Doors that had once been locked now stood open, revealing rooms stripped of anything unnecessary for living or dying. Charts lined the walls, each marked with neat columns and impersonal headings. She understood the message immediately. You are too useful to exclude, and too dangerous to leave unsupervised? Inside the sealed wing, time behaved differently. Days blurred, procedures repeated, faces changed. Outcomes were recorded with mechanical precision. She was asked for opinions that would determine who progressed and who did not. Each answer felt like a verdict. She began delaying decisions, requesting additional observation, recommending rest where escalation was expected. Small acts, each barely noticeable alone, but together, disruptive, risky. The chaos peaked not with violence but with silence. One night the camp went still. No shouting, no boots. Even the wire seemed quieter. She sensed it before she saw it, the feeling that something irreversible was underway. At dawn, trucks arrived. Evacuation orders had come. Records were to be destroyed. Transfers accelerated. The sealed wing was to be emptied by whatever means were fastest, as names were called and crossed off lists. She stood in the infirmary doorway, watching her world collapse into motion. Patients she had protected disappeared into transports bound for unknown destinations. Others were left behind, deemed no longer useful. In that moment, the full weight of her transformation settled over her. She was no longer simply reacting to chaos. She was inside it, shaping it, resisting it, surviving it, and as the last truck pulled away, she realized the most dangerous truth of all. The camp had changed her not by breaking her ethics, but by forcing her to weaponize them. Asterisk, the escalation did not arrive with shouting or gunfire. It arrived with paperwork. A thin folder appeared on her desk one morning, its cover stamped with a classification she had only seen once before. Inside were schedules, transfer orders, and a short memorandum written in language so neutral it felt obscene. The sealed wing was entering final optimization. Personnel were to assist in accelerating outcomes. Efficiency was now the priority. Survival was no longer the metric by which success would be measured. She closed the folder slowly, aware that the act itself might be observed from that moment on. Every hour felt borrowed. The camp's rhythm changed again. Trucks idled longer in the yard. Guards rotated more frequently, unfamiliar faces, watching familiar routines with cold curiosity. Inside the sealed wing, procedures that had once been spaced over days were compressed into hours. Men were pushed through stages without recovery time, their bodies treated as systems to be stressed until failure revealed something useful. From her perspective, she recognized the early signs of collapse, the tremor before organ failure, the confusion that preceded irreversible shock. She intervened constantly, recommending pauses, hydration, observation. Each suggestion was met with polite nods and quiet dismissals. The decisions were no longer hers. From the command perspective, the escalation was overdue. The front was unstable. Intelligence was scarce. Results were demanded. The sealed wing existed precisely for moments like this, when ethical hesitation was framed as a luxury no longer affordable. The doctor's presence was tolerated, because it lent legitimacy and because her skill extended the window in which data could be extracted. She understood then the cruel irony of her position. By keeping them alive, she was making the process possible. That realization nearly broke her. The first near-death incident came without warning. A patient barely more than a boy went into sudden respiratory collapse mid-procedure. The room froze. Orders conflicted. Someone shouted for restraints. Someone else for more dosage? She moved automatically, shoving hands aside, forcing air into lungs that resisted every breath. Seconds stretched into something elastic and unreal. When the boy stabilized, barely, the room exhaled. No one thanked her. Instead, a note was added to the chart. Subject demonstrates extended tolerance under intervention. Her success had raised the stakes. That night, she did something she had avoided for months, she cried. Not openly, not loudly. Just a quiet breakdown in a supply closet, forehead pressed to cold metal shelves, breath hitching as she forced herself to stop before anyone could hear. When she emerged, her face was composed, her posture steady. The transformation was complete now. Emotion had become something to be managed, not expressed. She began taking bigger risks. Dosages were altered more dramatically. Symptoms were exaggerated in reports. She coached patients in subtle ways how to breathe shallowly, to mimic distress, how to delay responses, how to appear compliant while conserving strength. Each act of defiance was wrapped in plausibility. Hidden beneath clinical language and professional demeanor, still. The net tightened and inspection was announced, not internal, external. The kind that arrived unannounced and asked questions no one wanted to answer. For 3 days, the camp prepared. Barracks scrubbed. Records curated, patients reassigned to present acceptable outcomes. She was instructed to limit her interactions, to answer only what was asked, to let others speak for her on the morning of the inspection. She walked through the sealed wing knowing this might be her last day there. The inspectors moved efficiently, their questions precise. They watched procedures with detached interest. When they reached her station, one of them paused, studying her notes longer than necessary. He asked about anomalies, about discrepancies, about recovery rates that deviated from projections. She answered calmly. She explained variance as biology, complications as inevitability, survival as noise in the data. The inspector nodded slowly. Then he asked the question she had feared. If your interventions were removed, he said, would outcomes improve? The room went silent. This was the moment. The hinge on which everything turned. She could lie. She could hedge. She could say nothing. Instead, she said, they would conclude faster. Asterisk, the inspector met her eyes. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or warning. He closed the file without comment and moved on. That evening, she was informed that she would be reassigned, not removed. Promoted her. Expertise was now deemed essential to the sealed wing's final phase. It was both a victory and a sentence. The escalation accelerated beyond control. Transfers began nightly. Patients disappeared faster than she could track. The infirmary outside the sealed wing emptied, its purpose diminished. Guards grew harsher, less patient, as if trying. to outrun something they sensed approaching. And then the artillery grew louder. Not close enough to panic, but close enough to matter. Evacuation plans were drafted and redrafted. Priorities shifted hourly. Records were duplicated, then destroyed, then reconstructed from memory. In the chaos, she saw her opening. She began memorizing everything, not copying, not stealing, learning names, numbers, protocols. Outcomes, she burned details into her mind during procedures. During rounds, during sleepless nights when the camp trembled faintly with distant bombardment, one night, a patient she had coached too well resisted too openly. He was taken away before she could intervene the next morning. She found his number crossed out in red. That mark haunted her. The climax came on the final full night. 4 evacuation orders were executed. The sealed wing was operating at maximum capacity. Power flickered. Sirens wailed in the distance, not air raid, but alert. Trucks lined the yard, engines running. Inside, decisions were made at a pace that left no room for doubt. She was ordered to approve a final sequence. The implications were clear. If implemented, no one would survive long enough to be transferred. It would erase evidence, simplify logistics, close the chapter. She stood over the chart, pen poised, time stretched around her. The machinery of escalation, weighted guards, officials, protocols, all aligned toward a single outcome. The system did not need her morality. It needed her compliance. She signed, but she changed one variable. Just enough, the sequence would fail not immediately. The patients would deteriorate too quickly to be moved, forcing delays, intervention, chaos. It was a gamble. One that risked exposure. One that risked lives? Asterisk, but it would stop the process. Minutes later, alarms sounded inside the wing. Not loud enough to draw outside attention, but sharp enough to trigger confusion. Orders clashed. Someone shouted for reversal. Someone else for restraint. The schedule collapsed. In the chaos, transfers were postponed, evacuation accelerated, and in the confusion, records were abandoned. As dawn approached, the camp stood on the edge of dissolution. Guards burned files and barrels. Officers shouted conflicting commands. Prisoners waited, uncertain whether they were about to be moved or erased. She stood in the infirmary doorway, watching it all unravel. This was the climax, not of violence, but of consequence. Every choice she had made converged here, every lie, every delay, every calculated risk. She had not stopped the machine, but she had jammed it long enough for history to notice. As the first evacuation truck rolled out, she understood something with chilling clarity. She would leave this place alive, but she would never leave it unchanged. Asterisk. The end did not feel like an ending. It arrived quietly, almost politely, on a morning that looked no different from the ones before it. The sky was the same dull gray. The wire still hummed. The guards still shouted. But something underneath it all had shifted. It's like a structure whose supports had been cut while the walls remained standing. Liberation, when it came, did not storm the gates. It crept in through abandoned offices and half-burned files, through trucks left idling and never returned, through uniforms shed in haste and authority that evaporated overnight. By the time foreign troops reached the camp, there was no one left to surrender. Only the prisoners remained. They stood in the yard unsure what freedom was supposed to look like. Some wept, some laughed, some simply sat down, as if movement itself had lost meaning. The infirmary door stood open, its shelves half empty, its beds filled with men who no longer knew whether they were allowed to rest. She stayed, not because she was ordered to, but because she could not yet leave. She moved through the camp in the days. It followed like a ghost with purpose-checking wounds, organizing lists, answering questions she had no answers for. Many asked the same thing in different languages. Who will remember what happened here? She never promised that the world would listen, only that someone would write it down. The investigators arrived weeks later. They wore clean uniforms and carried clipboards, their shock carefully managed behind professional detachment. They asked for names, dates, descriptions, She gave them facts stripped of emotion, because emotion slowed the process and the truth could not afford delay. When they asked for documentation, she produced what she could: partial records, reconstructed protocols, memorized sequences of events spoken. Allowed before exhaustion erased them. Some officers listened intently, others nodded and moved on. Files were labeled, boxes were sealed, and then, inevitably, decisions were made above her head. Jurisdictional disputes, classification levels, questions of proof, questions of relevance. The camp was categorized, its contents redistributed into archives where urgency dissolved into procedure. Months later, she learned that several sealed wing records had gone missing. No explanation, just absence. She returned to civilian life without ceremony. No parade, no debrief that captured the truth. On paper, she resumed her role as a physician. In practice, she never did. Her hands still healed, but her mind operated on a different axis. Now, one calibrated to silence, to implication, to the knowledge that systems could commit atrocities without ever raising their voices. Colleagues noticed the change. She asked unusual questions. She lingered too long over consent forms. She insisted on documentation others found excessive. When pressed, she deflected with professionalism so polished it discouraged further inquiry. The past had taught her how to disappear in plain sight. Years passed. Occasionally, a former prisoner would write to her. Short letters, careful language, gratitude that never quite named what it was grateful for. One man enclosed a photograph of his family. Another sent nothing but a date and the words, "I remember she kept them all." When journalists eventually came asking about the camp, she declined interviews. When historians reached out, she referred them to the archives, knowing full well what was not there. Silence, she had learned, was not always a failure of courage. Sometimes it was a calculation born of experience. In her private notes, written late at night and never published, she asked herself the question that haunted her most. At what point does survival become complicity? She never answered it. Instead, she documented. She wrote down what she had seen, what she had altered, what she had prevented, and what she had failed to stop. She described the sealed wing without naming it. She recorded procedures without assigning authorship. She left behind a map of fragments, enough for someone patient to reconstruct the truth, but not enough to endanger those who still lived. When she died decades later, those notes were found in a locked drawer. Some were archived, some were deemed inconclusive, some disappeared, and yet traces remain in footnotes that don't quite align, in survival rates that defy projections, in testimonies that describe a doctor who did more than treat wounds, who taught men how to endure, how to delay, how to resist without ever lifting a weapon. She entered the German POW camp as a doctor. She left as something else, not a hero, not a villain, not a martyr, but a reminder that in the darkest systems ever built, resistance did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it wore a white coat. Sometimes it spoke in clinical language. Sometimes it saved lives not by stopping the machine, but by learning how to slow it down just enough for history to catch up. And the most unsettling truth of all remains unanswered. How many others like her existed, and how many never left anything behind for us to find? Fade out.